Hello, Arcadia, and welcome to Politi-Corner's 2020 election panel. I'm Lauren Sung.
And I'm Riley Kovacev. Joining us today is Evelyn Lowe, a senior who is our liberal commentator, and Jack Wang, a senior who is our conservative commentator. By the way, thank you to our guests for wearing pink for the show today.
With the 2020 election season winding down to its final weeks, there is definitely a lot to talk about. For now, let's start with the Supreme Court. So, Evelyn, how will the impending change within the Supreme Court affect the future of American politics, and how should the public feel about this shift?
That's a great question, Lawrence. Thank you so much for asking. Well, obviously, we know that Amy Barrett is the Supreme Court nominee. So if she is confirmed, the court is definitely going to have a very conservative tilt. She's known for her desire to overturn Roe v. Wade, get rid of the Affordable Care Act, and she is against gun control. But more importantly, I really want to stress her inability to separate religion from her decisions in courts of law. So in 1998, she actually wrote and published a law review where she talks about how, as a judge, she has to consider her Catholic values while making her decisions, which inherently violates the separation of church and state foundation that the country really stresses, because religion has no place in a court of law. So in terms of how the public should feel, I feel like you should feel very scared, especially if you're a woman, especially if you cannot afford healthcare, and especially if you are LGBTQ+.
I see. Jack, your opinion?
Well, as Evelyn said, obviously this will shift the political landscape regarding Roe v. Wade, gun control, and all of these policies. But I do want to make one thing clear. People are definitely over-exaggerating what's going to happen. First of all, yes, the Supreme Court now has a conservative leaning. However, that does not mean that all of these minority groups that Evelyn talked about will be affected in some way. In fact, the typical American should not be worried about this change at all, because again, this will not affect them in long-term policies. We do have checks and balances that stops the Supreme Court from making ultimate decisions. And again, I have to reiterate, if you are worried about this decision, yes, our Supreme Court will have a conservative leaning. Yes, policies will be made for the Conservative Party. Not necessarily entirely, but definitely there will be a leaning. I won't argue against that. But again, I see people over-exaggerating what's going to happen. For example, people are saying that LGBTQ rights are going to be stripped, or people are going to say that, yes, everyone can buy guns, or their gun show loopholes are going to be exacerbated. All these things are being said by people, yet they're just completely not true. Again, I do believe that there will be a shift, but you shouldn't be too worried about this.
All right, thank you to you both. Riley?
All right, Jack, you'll start off on this one. Can you please explain the importance that COVID-19 will have on this election in terms of the Trump administration's handling of the pandemic, state responses, and most importantly, Trump's most recent diagnosis?
Well, people tend to think of Trump as a sole culprit of COVID-19 deaths, but I do believe that that's not entirely true, because as we can see in Michigan, Governor Whitmer is concealing a lot of COVID-19 deaths regarding comorbidities and also nursing home deaths. And this does make up a heavy portion of the total COVID deaths. And Trump is not to blame because he does not have jurisdiction over these state-run policies. On that regard, Biden also advocated for reopening the borders 3 weeks after Trump closed it. And that's definitely going to cause more deaths, yet no one is talking about it. Trump is not the sole culprit of people dying because of COVID-19. Again, I do believe that he's made some poor policies and poor remarks regarding wearing masks and all of these things, but he is definitely not to blame for states such as New York and Michigan sending sick elderly people back into nursing homes. That's causing thousands upon thousands of deaths. Overall, again, I have to reiterate, Donald Trump did in fact get COVID-19, and I sincerely wish him well. I don't agree with him on some policies. I don't agree with him on other policies, but what I can say is that he is a human being and he is the president of the United States. So for the compassionate party, supposedly the liberals, you guys should also wish him well instead of wishing him death. It's utterly ruthless to wish someone to die simply because you disagree with their policy making. And I do believe that he will make a successful recovery.
All right, Evelyn?
So I actually agree with what Jack said about how Trump is not solely to blame for the COVID-19 deaths. Obviously, Trump has no control over what state policy is. However, I do believe that Trump is to blame to a large portion of the population not wearing the masks, not social distancing, because Trump is promoting the message of if you wear a mask, you are a sheep. And a lot of his voters eat that up because his voter base is extremely strong. So in terms of the election, I really don't think that Trump's handling of COVID-19 is actually going to affect his polling at all. Like I said prior, his voter base is extremely loyal to him. And they believe everything he says about COVID-19, that it's a hoax, it's not serious, and you don't need to wear a mask. Even now that he's tested positive, he literally tweeted that we don't need to be afraid of COVID. So basically, like, the people who were going to vote for him before the pandemic are still going to vote for him because he has done, in my opinion, a really phenomenal job of appealing to them. He's truly a fantastic campaigner, and that's why his base is so strong and will never turn on him. So in terms of the election, I don't really believe that COVID-19 is going to have a big effect on the polling. It's only alienated the liberals from, Trump even further.
Thank you, Evelyn.
All right. And finally, is there a need to reform the justice system in this country? And is defunding the police the right way to do this? We go to Evelyn for her response.
Yeah, so I think there definitely is a need to reform the justice system because in the status quo, a lot of minorities are being thrown in jail for crimes that their white counterparts get a slap on the wrist for, and especially the Black community has to deal with police brutality. However, I don't believe that defunding the police is actually at all feasible because America is largely still moderate to right-leaning, and there's still that perception that the police are there to protect us from crime. There's also a really negative connotation around defunding. People think that it means abolishing or cutting resources from the police, but rather it actually entails reallocating those funds into community services to help reduce crime at its root cause. For example, cutting funds from the police department would mean reallocating them into homeless services or like other mental health services that would stop crime at its root cause. That is something that I can agree with, and Arcadia actually is doing a really good job with that.
All right, Jack?
Well, what Evelyn said is partially true in the sense that defunding the police is not feasible. And they did try it. Again, in state-run policies, they did try to defund the police. And in New York, crime rates skyrocketed over 100% after doing so. And what I will say in that regard is that defunding police is definitely not the way to go. However, justice reforms is indeed necessary. What I mean by that is we have some of the highest incarceration rates in all of the world, and that's definitely not a positive sign. We're throwing people in jail and incriminating them for small petty crimes that should not send them to jail in the first place. And I do agree in that regard. However, the Black community is definitely not over police, and they're not necessarily suffering from the police brutality that you're indoctrinated to believe. Again, I do support the Black Lives Matter movement, but not the organization. The organization is simply a means of again, their manifesto on their website states that they want to abolish the police system and the nuclear family structure. And that's something I definitely do not agree with. Again, there are indeed brutal polices and there are bad polices. There are racist cops and there are good cops. But you cannot classify 13 deaths in one single year and attribute it to cops mass killing Black individuals. That's just entirely not true. Overall, again, what Evelyn said is true. Defunding the police is definitely not the way to go. And justice reform is necessary in regards to incarceration and incriminating people. But yeah.
All right. Thanks, Jack. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you all the panelists for sharing your input on some of the major political issues of today. Tune in to APN within the following weeks for more 2020 election coverage. This has been Politi-Corner. Back to Clara and Gazelle at home.